It's worth focusing sharply and narrowly on the question of media, institutions, and democracy, not just because these were, in many ways, the central preoccupation of Narendran's life and work as a journalist, but also because of the extraordinary challenges that we face today in India, as a country, as a people. Challenges which are more than apparent, no matter where you live, no matter what line of work you're in. If you are a living, breathing, thinking person, if you are an aware person, if you follow what's been happening in this country, politically, economically, socially, culturally, in the sphere of law, in the sphere of education, in the sphere of women's rights, health, public health, it should be apparent that we are going through a grave crisis, a crisis accentuated and made almost insufferable by the simple fact that democracy as we know it, democracy as it should be, I regret to say, barely exists in this country anymore. This may strike a casual observer as a rather odd statement to make. We are, after all, witness to regular elections being held everywhere, except, I should add, in the former state and now the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, which has been without elections for nearly 5 years. But elections held regularly are a fact of life. Governments get elected, they get defeated. So on what basis am I making this claim that democracy in India is under severe strain? I can do no better than to point to bits and pieces of anecdotal evidence, because all of you have your own experiences, all of you have your own assessments, all of you have experienced moments when you feel, how is this even possible in our country? That somebody's voice can be silenced, somebody can be arrested, somebody can be incarcerated without bail for months, if not years on end. And the example I will start with is really a very recent one, which is the protest organized by the opposition. Initially, it was centered around the demand for a debate in Parliament on the problem of inflation, unemployment, and general hardship being felt by people. And when the government refused to concede the demand for a debate in Parliament, we saw extraordinary scenes of MPs being disqualified en masse, all because the government was not willing to entertain a discussion on a subject that it felt would be critical to its own handling. And in Parliament, of all places, where they have a substantial majority, such a debate initially was deemed unacceptable, and opposition members were punished for making such a demand. That was, of course, the previous week, but what happened over the last few days was a protest organized in Delhi by the Congress party and its leaders against the same set of issues. Now, this is standard fare in any democracy. There's no democracy in the world where the opposition wouldn't take to the streets at some point or the other to protest something or the other. And the rules of the game are such that as long as there's no rioting, an assembly of people raising demands against the government, a peaceful assembly of people, is never seen as a problem. The Indian Constitution, in fact, guarantees freedom of assembly as one of the fundamental rights that citizens have. But in the New Delhi of New India, freedom of assembly, especially when the purpose of the assembly is to criticize the government, is increasingly being denied. You can have a gathering even when Section 144 is imposed, which prohibits the assembly of 5 or more persons in one place. You can have a gathering in defiance of 144 where you call for the genocide of Muslims, or where you call for the boycott of Muslims, or where you call for a whole range of other illegal and morally bankrupt demands. And yet the strong arm of the law will not be brought down upon your neck. But if you demand that there be some accountability from the Prime Minister about all the promises that he made, and that there be a debate, that there be discussion, then such an assembly is deemed to be unacceptable. Police force will be used, and of course we saw what happened in the streets of Delhi when leaders of the Congress party were dragged away. Now, when I say democracy is under strain, I don't simply mean that, I don't simply mean, I'm not simply pointing to the failure or the inability of opposition leaders to protest. Of course, that's an important aspect. But I was struck, and that's what I wanted to share with you, I was struck by the statement that the Home Minister of India, Mr. Amit Shah, made, where it was a statement he gave to ANI news agency, where he pointed to the fact that the Congress leaders were all wearing black clothes. Now, for some reason or the other, this fine tradition of ours in Tamil Nadu of wearing black shirts as a defiance has caught on across India, and the use of black flags, black clothes is slowly gaining currency or gaining ground as a color of protest. Many of Mr. Modi and Mr. Amit Shah's public meetings in Bihar or UP or Rajasthan, the police always screens those who attend to see if they're wearing any black item of clothing, and then they're not allowed in. So the Congress party decided that, well, if the BJP doesn't like black, we're going to put on black shirts. And they staged this. So Mr. Amit Shah makes a statement to ANI that he questions the Congress's, the symbolic aspect of wearing black clothes. And he says, I think that the real purpose was to further their politics of appeasement, because this protest was held on August the 5th, which is the date that Mr. Modi inaugurated the construction of the Ram Temple. Now, you think about this, it's an extraordinary statement that you need to unpack at different levels. And to bear in mind that this is coming from the Home Minister of India, who is the man who sits at the apex of the law enforcement machinery, whose job definition is to ensure the maintenance of law and order, whose job is actually to ensure that laws which prohibit the incitement of hatred of one religion against the other, or the targeting of one religion, is not to ensure that those laws are enforced. That's his job. Instead, you have this gentleman, who is the Home Minister of India, in order to attack the Congress for their protest on the price rise, dragging Muslims in. Now, what do Muslims, and of course, everybody understands what this, when the BJP says appeasement politics, everybody knows what he means. He's saying that he's putting Muslims at the center, that these are the bad guys who don't want Ram Mandir, and by extension, who don't want India's progress, who are against India, etc., etc. So the Ram Mandir is meant to stand for India in a larger sense. So he's putting Muslims at the center and saying these are the guys who don't believe in Ram/India, and the Congress's fault is that they are appeasing, they're giving in to the demands of these guys. So actually, under the guise of criticizing the Congress, what he is actually doing, and please bear this in mind, what the Home Minister of India is actually doing is pointing a finger and blaming the Muslims of India. And I was struck by this statement of Mr. Shah because in one sentence, or jumla as they say, in one sentence he was able to, and this is his skill actually, as a politician. In one sentence, you devalue the importance of protest and similarly you, in that one sentence, accomplish the task of vilifying Muslims and further polarizing this country of ours on the basis of religion. And I was struck when, in preparing for this lecture, struck by how apt this one brief statement of Mr. Amit Shah was, because it underlines the fact that the principal challenges we face today are the attempt to demean and belittle and actually prohibit or outlaw protest and dissent, and the problem of growing communalization of the polity. A communalization which is not happening by itself in a random way, but is the product of a continuous and well-designed, well-planned, top-down strategy. And once you have the clear line set from the top, that dissent is, whatever form dissent takes, it's unacceptable. Either because this dissent is appeasing Muslims, or this dissent is anti-national, or this dissent is against the unity of India. They can attach any label they want, but their idea is that protest, dissent, debate, discussion, all of these have become more and more difficult, if not impossible. And it's no use pointing to a gathering like this. Such events happen in many parts of India without any problem. But such events are actually quite difficult to organize in many places as well. In Jammu and Kashmir, such an event would be impossible to organize. I don't know how many of you know that the Mirwais, who is the leader of the Hurriyat, and you don't have to agree with his politics, his separatist politics. We know what he stands for. But he's been in house arrest for 3 years now, deprived of his liberty without charge, without trial, without any formal process being involved, and in the absence of a formal process, as we saw in the 1 year after the reading down of Article 370, when many of those who were detained, Saifuddin Soz, for example, the Congress leader, former minister, he was one of those who had been kept under house arrest for months. And when he challenged his detention in the Supreme Court, the government said, well, we haven't detained him. And then we had reporters filming outside his house, where when Mr. Soz tries to leave his gate, the police stops him. And the lawyer points to this in the Supreme Court, but the government insists that, no, we haven't stopped him. There's no detention order. So you can be detained without an order. When you challenge your detention, they say, well, there's no order. So since there's no order, the court says, what relief can we give? So the Mirwais have spent 3 years in effective house arrest. Kashmiri students, Kashmiri journalists who attempt to fly abroad in pursuit of their careers are stopped at the airport without any reason being given. Sana Mattu, who was the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for photography, she's a leading photographer based in Srinagar, when she was flying to Paris for an exhibition, stopped at Delhi airport, not allowed to fly, no explanation given. Another journalist was headed to Colombo to report on the unrest over there for a British newspaper, and at Delhi airport, not allowed to fly. So even this kind of interaction that we take for granted is difficult in many places. And I may choose to speak freely, Madhavan Kutti may choose to speak freely, but you have dozens, if not more, hundreds of people who perhaps rightly or wrongly feel they must censor themselves when they speak, so that no case is filed against them, no action is taken against them, no vendetta is launched. So the very starting point of dissent, which is debate, discussion, in order to dissent or disagree, you have to first be able to discuss. I recall being invited for a discussion at one of the Delhi University colleges soon after Article 370 was read down. And the person who invited me said, we want to discuss J&K and 370. And I said, sure, I'm happy to talk about it. And when I arrived at the college, I found that the title of the seminar was, What Future for Indian Federalism? And I said, I said, of course, yeah, Kashmir, everything fits into this, but this is a very funny kind of topic. And they said, well, that was the only way in which the principal and the Delhi University authorities would allow the seminar to go ahead. That if you have the word Kashmir or 370, then you run into trouble. And this is happening in Delhi University. I had a similar experience in IIT Bombay. And I'm sure all of you have come across examples of this kind, where because of the thrust and the overall line being set from the top by people like Mr. Amit Shah and Narendra Modi, you have implementation on the ground, which is making that debate and discussion more and more difficult. One of the weapons being used to stifle discussion or debate is the FIR, or First Information Report, which is the launching of a criminal case by the police. Since we are in Trivandrum, all of you would be familiar with the case that's been filed in Uttar Pradesh against the weak. And it's a comment on our times that when I first saw on Twitter that there was such a case and that they had run a column with a painting and Vivek Debroi had withdrawn his column and the police had filed a case and Week had apologized, it took me, honestly, a few hours. I read all the different news reports. In none of those reports could I find the image that was found objectionable. Forget the image. In none of those reports could I find even a proper description of what that image was which led to the filing of a police case. And the reason for this is very simple. Which news media is going to risk having a case filed against its own staff when the UP police is so trigger happy? So after a bit of research and digging and so on, I came across the image. I'm sure all of you have seen it. Circa 1800 to 1825, Kangra Valley painting. Beautiful painting. a depiction of Kali and Shiva, which was quite common in the 19th century among artists. I came across similar images done by artists in Rajasthan in the 19th century. Some say that the imagination is the tantric one. But essentially, what struck me when I saw the image was the manner in which artists in that era freely imagined their own conception and relationship with God, with different divinities, imagined the relationship between those divinities in a free and unconstrained manner, and sought to depict those, and never faced any problem, either from their sponsors, who were all Hindu kings, by the way, or from the wider public. None of these occasioned any filing of criminal charges back in the 19th century or earlier. But it's a measure of the extent to which the Indian mind has closed or the Indian mind has been forced shut. That today it is very difficult to have an open public discussion on the iconography of those artists, what it symbolizes, what they were trying to convey, and one can agree or disagree. But it's virtually impossible to have a discussion on this, because there is no telling what discussion will be in this era of smartphones will be videotaped, what fragment will be shown on social media and then given to the police, and some BJYM or BJP leader will say, my religious feelings have been hurt, file a case, and a case will be filed. So this forced closure of the Indian mind, that you cannot show these things, you cannot debate these things. And what is extraordinary is this is being done by people who claim to be Hindu nationalists, who don't want to leave any room, actually, for discussion on Hindu theology, Hindu iconography, except what they want to dictate as acceptable. And so you have a case filed. Regrettably, the weak, instead of contesting such a case and insisting that there was nothing vulgar or obscene in the use of a 19th century painting from Kangra, chose to apologize and withdraw. And I can bet you that that apology and that withdrawal is not going to lead to the end of the case. That case will carry on. That case will linger. And because of this apology and capitulation and the failure to defend and stand up for what is correct, you will have emboldened the police, you will have emboldened all of these narrow-minded bigots who believe that only what they think about religion or God or country or whatever, only that is proper and correct, and everything else is not allowed and illegal. Since we're talking about Uttar Pradesh, and this brings me to the communalization aspect. And I'm trying to keep this lecture really very current because, we've been through 7-8 years of this, and each year throws out new horrors, and each month brings new horrors, and in a way that, there's an abundance of choice of examples to cite, so it's easiest to just look at the most recent ones. I don't know, I wonder if you saw the story about the school in Kanpur, Florets International School, which for several years now, as part of its morning assembly, had been reading or teaching the prayers of different religions to all of its students. Every school has its own tradition. in one school that I went to, a boarding school in Ajmer, most of the prayers that we sang in the morning were Hindu prayers, and there was the odd Iqbal poem, etc. But nobody. This was not a big issue. Nobody. I mean, as kids, we never liked. You are undisciplined as a child. And another school I went to had this very talented young boy who would sing and recite from the holy books of different religions. And one assembly he would recite from the Quran, another assembly he would recite Gurbani or the Gita. This is part of how we all grew up. And some parent in Kanpur objected to the fact that their child was having to listen to an Islamic prayer and complained to the school. The school promptly, of course, they defended what they were doing, but they said, since some parents are objecting, we will stop the teaching of all prayers and the kids will only sing the national anthem. But that didn't end their trouble, because the police then went and filed a case under section 295A of the Indian Penal Code and a section of the Uttar Pradesh law which prohibits religious conversion. Now think about this for a second. You have a school that is teaching in the morning assembly prayers of 4 religions: Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, and Sikhism. The Muslim prayer is singled out as objectionable. In many ways, just as Mr. Amit Shah and Mr. Modi singled out the Muslim refugee when they were discussing the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act. So Muslim prayer, Muslim refugee, all of this is not acceptable. And the police then says, because you included a Muslim prayer as part of your multi-faith prayer offering, this must be a plan to convert kids to Islam. And 295 is to deliberately insult some religion. Now, I don't know how reciting something from the Quran as part of multi-faith prayer is an insult to one religion. Somebody should ask these policemen, where do you think, how do you, what is the logic that you guys apply when you file these charges? But a case has been filed, the school is sealed, and even if this is an example of illiterate, overzealous policemen, you would think that any minister with half a brain would say this is nonsense and find ways to put a stop to this. But silence from the Uttar Pradesh leadership and silence from this gentleman, the Home Minister of India, whose only concern is appeasement. This brings me to the other area where there is silence, which is the judiciary. Because when we speak of robust institutions, the Constitution of India, which was adopted in 1950, envisaged the judiciary as a robust, independent institution that would stand as a check to the abuse of power by the executive. There are, of course, serious problems of design. I think it also takes a very long time in the life of a democracy for institutions to develop a certain amount of institutional integrity. The same Supreme Court in the United States, which gave positive judgments at one point, say in the late 20th century, also upheld slavery in the 19th. So democracy and the independence of judiciary, I understand, is an evolutionary process. But each democracy, the whole point is that each democracy gets to learn from the mistakes of the other ones that preceded it. If it took the United States' judiciary more than 200 years before it truly embraced the concept of justice for all, that all men and women are born and created equal, and that laws and practices in the United States have to reflect that belief and that understanding. If it took the US Supreme Court that long, it's not the case that the Indian Supreme Court has to take 200 years to reach the same understanding. In many ways, the Supreme Court back in the day went the extra mile in defending the rights of citizens in the face of executive overreach. Of course, there are many examples where the Supreme Court did the opposite. So this has been an uneven road. But what we have seen in the last couple of years, and in particular the last 6 months, is what the legal scholar Gautam Bhatia calls the executive court. The Supreme Court, which is meant to be separate from the executive, right? The judiciary is a separate pillar of the state. It's not the executive. It's not beholden to the executive. It owes nothing to the executive. Yet, increasingly we see the Supreme Court acting as an executive court. And I'll give you 3 examples of where the Supreme Court positively behaved as an executive court, and then a few examples of where the Supreme Court, by abdication, also played the executive's game. But let's look at the 3 cases where the Supreme Court actually has gone out of its way to bat for the executive. The Zakia Jafri judgment in the case of her petition on the Gujarat riots of 2002, which came in May. The more recent Himanshu Kumar judgment on Chhattisgarh, and the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, PMLA judgment. All 3 of these judgments have one judge in common, that's Justice A.M. Khanwilkar, who is now retired. Where he will emerge upon retirement, we don't know as yet. But certainly these 3 pre-retirement judgments of his tell us a great deal about his understanding of the law, tell us a great deal about his understanding of how fundamental are the rights of citizens. Because in the case of Gujarat and in the case of Chhattisgarh, and I'm not going to argue about the finding, was the bench right or wrong in rejecting Zakia Jafri's petition or rejecting Himanshu Kumar? That's a debate for another day. Although I do think that the court's reasoning was extraordinarily poor and full of holes, and it should be debated and challenged. But let's set that aside for a moment. What I found shocking, and many people have commented on this in the media, is the court's decision to blame the petitioners for having come to court in the first place. In the Gujarat matter, in fact, the court even seemed to suggest that the delay, the fact that this process had taken 15 or 16 years, was somehow the fault of the petitioners. Whereas this is how long justice in this country takes, or injustice in this country takes. And in the case of Himanshu Kumar, the Chhattisgarh matter too, for the court to suggest to the executive that here you are, we found in your favor, we've rejected these petitions, so don't worry, we're not going to ask for any of your guys to be prosecuted. And here is a bonus gift. We give you the green light to prosecute these two sets of petitioners who in some ways dared to lay an accusation against you. So Teesta Setalwad, who single-handedly, along with others, along with the NHRC, along with Mukul Sinha, and a lot of people who fought for justice, but as somebody who's been there for the last 20 plus years, who has done so much to highlight the suffering of the victims of the 2002 violence and to show how the state was guilty through acts of omission and commission in that violence. She has now been arrested, denied bail, and the Supreme Court, in a way, the kind of language it used in that judgment, has essentially tied the hands of any lower level court that is going to try her for these offenses. Because which trial court or even which high court is going to have the courage to confront a finding, quote unquote, a finding, incidentally, which the Supreme Court made without even giving Teesta a chance to be heard? Which court, lower court, is going to contest what the Supreme Court has said? In the case, the PMLA case, again, this, you would have seen arguments how the wanton abuse of authority which stares us in the face by the Enforcement Directorate, its ability to raid, arrest opposition leaders and others, whenever there is a case that the authority wants to prolong and it realizes that it does not have sufficient evidence to hold somebody. We have seen over the last few years how the Enforcement Directorate will be brought in to investigate a so-called proceeds of crime or black money angle. Even in the case of Zubair, there was talk. Mohammed Zubair, the Alt News co-founder. The police threw all kinds of useless charges against him, which they knew to be false. And when they realized that these charges may not stick, then other kind of financial charges were added on under the foreign contribution regulation, that even those are bogus charges. And there was talk about the Enforcement Directorate looking into this entire financial aspect. And this is clearly a way of keeping the pot boiling. And against this backdrop, to have the Supreme Court uphold the constitutionality of those particular sections of the PMLA is again simply granting a gift to the executive. Then you have failure of robust institutions by the judiciary, on the part of the judiciary when it comes to acts of omission or abdication of responsibility. We know it's been 3 years since Article 37, since Jammu Kashmir was deprived of its statehood, was partitioned and reduced, and of course deprived of its special status under the Constitution. Again, I'm not going into the merits or demerits of this. That's a debate or a discussion for a different day. But isn't it astonishing that the Supreme Court has not found the time in over 3 years to organize hearings and take a decision on this, on the constitutionality of this? Is this because the government fears? And I'm bringing the government in because when the government wants, it can tell the court, please prioritize this case. So the Ayodhya case was brought out of cold storage. The government told the court, please do this fast. The court said, okay, we'll do it fast. Why is the government not saying do 370 fast? Is it because the government knows that even a Supreme Court like the current one may find it difficult to validate what the government did? I don't know. But I find it astonishing that the court doesn't have the time. Equally, the court has refused so far to take on the important matter of electoral bonds. Anonymous funding is something which is recognized the world over as anathema, as bad for democracy. Citizens have a right to know who is the piper who's calling the tune. Why should the identity of donors to political parties be hidden? One argument given is that, well, the donor may feel intimidated by, may fear harassment or a vendetta. But we know that in the Indian system, it's the government that has the power to launch a vendetta. And the way the electoral bond scheme is structured, the identity of the donor is known to the government, if it wants to. Because State Bank of India, which sells these bonds, keeps a record of who it sold these bonds to. And how difficult is it for the finance minister or the prime minister to summon those records and figure out who's buying these electoral bonds? So the only purpose of the electoral bond scheme is to let the government know who's donating money where, but nobody else need to know, and it's not a surprise. And we can guess this not from, because we are not giving any data on where the electoral bonds money is ending up from the government. But we know from the income tax returns of political parties that the lion's share of money that is put into electoral bonds goes to the Bharatiya Janata Party. And I put it to you that Indian democracy is impoverished by not knowing who these guys are who are giving money to the ruling party. This is not good for democracy. Any child can say that, can see that. But the Supreme Court, it's been, I think, more than 3 years now, will not hear the case. Whenever there's a bit of pressure or debate or discussion in the public domain, the Chief Justice will say, well, we'll take it up soon, but nothing has happened. Habeas corpus, after the Kashmir situation, people were held in prison for months on end. The Supreme Court was least bothered to take up these matters urgently. We've seen, all of you would have followed as Kerala reporters, the case of Siddharth Kappan. And I was going through the recent Lucknow bench of Allahabad High Court order denying Siddharth Kappan bail. It's laughable. The kind of logic, the kind of claims that the police is making, referring to some pamphlets that are in the public domain in Malayalam, referring to some website which is a bogus website. If this is the evidence which they're going to use to hold a man without bail for more than 2 years, surely the High Court or the Supreme Court needs to step in. But no. So, if one is not able to knock on the doors of the judiciary, if that one robust institution which the Constitution promised us would be there as a check against abuse of authority by the executive, whether that abuse of authority involves your right to dissent, whether that abuse of authority involves the center promoting communal hatred and not fighting it, the court has been a very, very distant bystander. Even when individuals, when it's been brought to the court's notice how individuals connected to the ruling party have made genocidal speeches, the court will make some noises, somebody will get arrested and then quickly bailed out in a day. But for speeches that are far less liable for prosecution, like Umar Khalid's speech, or you can be in jail for years without any bail being granted. So if the judiciary is not going to perform that role, although I think we are duty bound to knock on its doors, and it's not as if there are not positive judgments that do emerge. They do. So we should not give up that. But are there other areas of focus or hope that we should think about? And here I just want to mention 3, and I'm coming to the last 10 minutes of my lecture. Media, federalism, and people's movements. We have seen, and I'll start with the last one first. We have seen examples over the last 3-4 years of the ability of popular resistance through people's movements, people's struggles, which to my mind is the most democratic thing actually in a democracy, when people themselves say that we are going to organize ourselves, we are going to make our voices heard. We are not going to rely simply on the formal mechanisms of voting, but we demand a voice and a say today when policies are adopted which are against our interests. So the extraordinary victory, although a partial one, that the farmers of India won is something which tells us that there are possibilities to oppose what is happening. There is hope. Of course, that remains a partial victory. I would say that the kind of forces that are arrayed against the farmers is still very formidable, and every attempt is being made to break the unity of farmers. But that remains as an example of what people, when they unite and stand by their demands, what they can accomplish, which was the rollback of anti-people laws. The protest against the Citizenship Amendment Act took things up to a certain level. Of course, the government was able to drown the anti-CAA protests in violence. So the anti-Muslim riots of Delhi were engineered in order to sabotage and derail the protests against the CAA. And of course, then you also had the pandemic which intervened. But I would say that the failure or the unwillingness of the government, having passed the CAA, to full-fledgedly implement that chronology which Mr. Amit Shah spoke about, CAA, NRC, is also the result of people making it very clear that they are going to resist this unitedly. And there are other examples too. So popular resistance has the ability to force the government to rethink, to change course, but not always and not in a comprehensive or complete manner. But it tells you that whatever may be the state of affairs at the level of political parties, at the level of electoral democracy, at the grassroots, popular ferment, popular dissent continues. People have not given up. And this is an important reality that we need to recognize. Second, I said federalism. In Modi's first term as Prime Minister, he led an assault against the media, against the judiciary, against universities, against the Reserve Bank of India. He staged a coup against the CBI, you remember? When you overthrew the director and put somebody else in. And in the second term of Mr. Modi, of course, the communalism is at a very high level, but he's also now made it very clear that the federal nature of India's polity is his target. And more, I think, states in India, those that are ruled by the opposition, but also in many cases, states that are ruled by BJP, realize that their prerogatives as states of the union are coming under threat. And that this balance which the Constitution struck between the rights of the states and the right of the union, the idea of a relationship, Mr. Modi paid lip service to that idea when he said he believes in cooperative federalism. The reality is something else. The reality is that the center has made steady inroads into the law and order field, has used GST to undermine the finances of states, has encroached on agriculture as a topic, and is actively involved in trying to destabilize state governments that are not ruled by the BJP. So in some cases toppling them, as we saw in Maharashtra, or finding other ways to undermine them. And I think this has also led to a certain level of resistance in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, but also Telangana, Andhra to a lesser extent, West Bengal. So this idea of federalism standing as a bulwark against the assault on democracy in India is a very powerful, important one. And I think that even as there will be a tendency by the BJP to run down and to somehow show the assertion of federalism as something that is anti-Indian, actually this is strengthening India, because India is a union of states. And that union can only be strong if each of the constituent states are strong and are going to fight for that union. And I think so this federalism as an important zone of resistance. And lastly, media. Now, media, of course, is a mixed bag. You know how dreadful the media can be and is actually, if you look at the big sections of media. Your largest TV channels, your large newspapers, how they have fully moved over, many of them, into the government camp, where they don't believe in in being truthful, they don't believe in challenging authority, they don't believe in asking questions. If at all they ask questions, they reserve those questions for the opposition. Worse, this media section has become an active promoter of communal hatred. And this is something very new on the Indian media landscape. Earlier, we had seen examples of media playing a partisan role at times of communal conflict. It would be for 1 or 2 months, they would fuel or help to prolong certain bouts of violence, and then they would go back to being normal. Today, you have channels which night after night serve as vehicles for anti-Muslim, for promoting anti-Muslim hatred, for creating distrust between Hindus and Muslims. The other night I saw on one of these channels a sensational program where the anchor was talking of how the population of Muslims is growing on UP's border and how this is a conspiracy against India. So every night there will be some topic or the other where Muslims will be brought in and there will be a debate and a discussion, which of course is angled in a certain way, calculated to make your blood boil if you are a Hindu. And that's the game that these channels are playing on behalf of the ruling party. It's of course very good for business. Many of them receive or get financial benefits in the form of advertising for doing this for playing this kind of role. But they are not the only players in the media. That's the most important point. Media comprises people like you. You may be working in media organizations of one kind or the other that are independent to varying degrees. But each of you has carved some space where you can do your work professionally. And the beauty about journalism is that, and which is why those in power fear it, is because you don't need to have any agenda beyond standing by the ethics and principles of your profession. Frankly, it doesn't matter to me if somebody votes for party A or party B or party C. As journalists, the most important yardstick is how do we approach reporting? How do we tell a story? How do we gather facts? How do we confirm them? How do we verify them? How do we make sure that the information we convey to readers is truthful, is properly sourced? or to viewers. That's all that a journalist needs to do. Nobody is asking a journalist to have any special commitment to this or that cause. Many of them do, and that's good if they do. But if they don't, that's also fine. But what you have to have is a commitment to truth-telling. What you have to have is an inquiring mind. What you have to have is a certain level of fearlessness, that you will ask your question, no matter how uncomfortable or embarrassed that minister or that official will be. When Smriti Irani held a press conference, shortly after the news broke about a restaurant in Goa being associated with her family, running with a slightly dodgy bar license, Smriti Irani held a press conference, quote unquote, so-called press conference, where she simply said that I will see the Congress in court and this is all lies. Not one of the reporters there bothered to ask her a simple question. That, madam, there is a video on YouTube where your daughter says that this is, when the daughter is asked, is this your restaurant? She says, yeah. So why did she say that, madam? Simple. You don't have to confront the minister. You don't have to say you're lying. But at least you have to ask the question. No? Because that's the least that your viewers expect, because all your viewers have seen that video. Everybody has seen that video on Twitter or Facebook or WhatsApp of Kunal Vijayakar introducing Zoe Shirani as a very, very young entrepreneur. Zoe Shirani, and he says, this is your restaurant, yeah? Correct? And she says, yes. People have seen that. So maybe she was exaggerating. I don't know. I mean, I'm saying that let's have an open mind. But you have to ask the question to Smriti Irani. How can you be a reporter going for a press conference and you simply take notes as to what she is saying? Don't you have a question to ask? And believe me, that's what journalism is. You have to ask the question. But if you're going to worry that, if I ask the question, she may get upset, or she may call my boss, she may very well call your boss. But don't be in this profession then. There's plenty of other jobs you can do. But if you want to be a journalist, then you have to ask and you have to ask the right question. You shouldn't be like that journalist who got onto the bulldozer that was demolishing people's homes in Jahangirpuri in Delhi and is asking the person in the bulldozer, how many houses are you going to demolish today? You have to ask the persons who sent him, on what basis are you demolishing these homes? When was notice first served? Can I see a copy of the notice? Have you served a notice on other illegal properties in Delhi? These are the questions. So, sadly, a lot of journalists in this country specialize in asking questions to the wrong people. They don't want to ask questions to those who really need to be asked. And that's not journalism. But there are people who do it properly. And there are actually quite a few. You'd be surprised because I receive freelance contributions from around the country. Even in a troubled area like Jammu Kashmir, where every journalist who files a story which is critical of the police or the army invariably gets summoned to the police station the next day. Ki bhai tumne kyo likha? Why did you write this? Even in a place like J&K, we get 7-8 pitches a week from freelance reporters who don't have any organization to back them. But they're filing those stories. They know that asking those questions will get them into trouble, but they ask those questions. Similarly, there are reporters in the Northeast and Chhattisgarh, in Madhya Pradesh and UP. Half the stories that we see coming out of Uttar Pradesh are because a video or a tweet that some freelance reporter in Banaras or Allahabad or Meerut or Muzaffarnagar has put onto social media, often at great risk to themselves. So actually, when we look at the media landscape in India, you have the visibly dominant big channels, big newspapers that have all gone over to the dark side, or most of them have, that have become part of the problem actually. And for that reason, of course, because they're large, because they're well-funded, they command a certain audience. But believe me, their credibility in the eyes of the people is low and is declining, and declining at a very rapid rate. And people are looking elsewhere for credible sources of information. Many of them read their news via digital news platforms. And there are dozens of credible digital platforms that have come up. The Wire is part of an organization called DigiPub, which is an association of digital news platforms, and we have dozens of members from around the country, virtually every state, virtually every language. You have small independent platforms that are doing the kind of work that the big organizations need to do but aren't. And they're doing this with low budgets, often facing all kinds of legal threats and challenges, but they're doing that work. And they are showing day in and day out that an alternative media, a truthful media, an independent media is possible and actually exists. What it lacks is the kind of support and the kind of financial heft that big media enjoys. But slowly, I think, independent digital media is getting there. And if there is hope in this country, in the face of an open war on all of our fundamental rights by the government, aided and abetted by institutions of one kind or the other, resisted partially by some institutions, sometimes in a kind of inexact or non-uniform way. If there is hope, that hope lies in the struggles of ordinary people when they fight for their rights. That hope lies in the growing realization in different states of the Indian Union that federalism, which is an important component of Indian democracy, is under attack. And that hope lies in those who still, despite all the pressure and legal cases and financial difficulties, still believe in practicing the honorable profession of journalism. And I think that we should not ever fall into the trap of imagining that we are few. Actually, we are many. Narendran was one such person whose memory we are honoring today. But in press clubs around the country and in the work of reporters who are either in existing organizations or who work freelance, and in the work of dozens of independent media platforms. And of course, there are some big media organizations too, which still believe in and stand by the fundamental principles of journalism. I've been very happy to see some of the reporting in Deccan Chronicle, in Deccan Herald, in the Hindu, Telegraph, and from time to time in some of the different Hindi newspapers. So there is still a lot of space where journalism is being practiced, where there is attention being paid to truth-telling. And slowly but surely, I think in the battle for public opinion, this media, of which you and I are both part, will grow stronger and will eventually prevail. Thank you very much.